designing the new cars. The main concern of designers and engineers was safety. Using their expertise, they worked tirelessly to create the safest cars possible, and by 1904, the rolling stock arrived, and the new subway opened.
Well, the very first cars ordered were called composite cars because they were a composite of wood and steel frames, steel underframes, but they had wooden sides and with copper sheathing over the lower part. And they were designed to preclude the operation of railroad freight cars through the tunnels. They were 51 feet long and 9 feet wide, roughly. The tunnels were designed to follow the layout of the street, the routes of the street, so as a result, there were very sharp turns. And the original August Belmont, who originated the subway, did this deliberately because he was afraid that the so-called robber barons of the railroads would see this wonderful way of getting freight delivered throughout the city, and they'd try to move into the subway system.
Two composite samples, the August Belmont and the John B. McDonald, named after the financier and the builder of the subways respectively, arrived at the IRT in 1902. Although the composite cars had a frame reinforced with wooden side timbers, the lower half of the car had a simulated wood design etched into the metal. This protected the car in the event of fire. This also gave rise to the appellation copper sides, used by the men of the IRT to differentiate them from the steel cars that arrived later. When the cars arrived from the builders, all of the electrical parts and other equipment were installed at three railway shops: 98th Street, 129th Street, and the main yard and shop at 147th Street and Lenox Avenue. The cars were tested extensively on the 2nd and 3rd Avenue elevated lines. The composites would prove themselves to be dependable cars. But in 1903, the first steel passenger car arrived. The first all-steel passenger car in the world was built by the Altoona shops of the Pennsylvania Railroad for the IRT. Car number 3342 was a one-of-a-kind, designed by George Gibbs, the chief engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad.
They were the Gibbs cars from the early 1900s until 1957. It's a long time for a subway car. And these cars were very strong, and they could do just about anything. Unfortunately, I didn't get to operate them, but I did ride them. And you could actually hear the electricity running through the cars.
The Gibbs car was an adaptation of the experimental car. Aluminum was used in place of steel to reduce the weight of the car. The design specifications ensured that they would be stronger and more crashworthy than the composite car. Each side contained a heavy steel girder, and this gave the cars enough strength so the floor and other parts of the structure would be light in weight. Another innovation in car design came in 1916 with the introduction of the low-voltage subway cars. These would be the final fleet of IRT cars for many years. The multiple unit door control, MUDC, was introduced in these cars in the early 1920s. It required only one conductor to control all of the doors on a train, reducing the need for multiple conductors. In the early 1920s, the BRT went bankrupt and was reorganized as the BMT.
The BMT was a rather progressive outfit. They were always looking to improve service. So they decided to see if they could come up with something even better. And in the mid-1920s, they set out to design what they called an articulated car. And it was three bodies joined together permanently, and they only used 4 trucks. So in other words, 2 of the car bodies shared a single truck.
The IRT low voltage and BMT cars had similar propulsion systems. This changed in 1925 with the introduction of the D-types. Arguably the best of the older style BMT cars, they introduced articulation to New York subway cars. This principle allowed the 3-section units to be placed on 4 trucks instead of the usual 6. The Ds were heavy, extremely well built, and corrected a few deficiencies inherent in the standards. One D unit had 800 horsepower as compared to the equivalent 2 standards that had only 560 horsepower. The D-types were capable of greater speed and boasted a quieter ride. The Board of Transportation drew heavily from the IRT and BMT cars and developed a design that utilized the best features of each one. These cars would be used on yet another system, called the IND.
And then as they expanded the IND, they built more and more cars until they were all the way up to the R9. Everything from R1s through R9s are pretty much identical. They're interchangeable, they can be operated interchangeably among themselves. And that was the standard car for the whole 8th Avenue independent subway system.
Finally, a car that was 60 feet long and 10 feet wide, that used one motor and one trailer truck, became the optimum choice. These dimensions are still used today for the new B division cars that serve the letter lines. The BMT was faced with the need to have a car capable of running on elevated structures, as well as entering the tunnel system. The older elevated lines could not withstand the weight of the B and D type cars.
So in 1934, they came out with two experimental lightweight trains. And they were also articulated.
The Multis were the first cars to run on both the elevated structures and in the subway. They were the longest articulated units ever operated on the New York City transit system. Measuring 179 feet in length, they were also the lightest, weighing under 90 tons.
They were ahead of their time. They had dynamic brakes also, a different braking system. The cars were shorter, and they only had 2 doors on one side per car. It was unique in the sense that they had a special button in the doorpost that when the train was laid up at a terminal, when it was cold outside, they kept all the doors closed, and they would activate this circuit, and the passengers themselves would push the button open, and the doors would open. There would be a slight delay. They could come in, and then the doors would close.
1939 brought the World's Fair to New York City. But how do you move millions of people in and out of one borough? The IRT received permission to order a small fleet of 50 cars from the St. Louis Car Company and to add express service on the Flushing line. The cars were designed by the Board of Transportation and the IRT and went into service in 1939 to much fanfare from the riding public. The center track on the Flushing line would be decided upon for express service to and from the fair. The BMT rebuilt many of its 1200 and 1400 series elevated cars into Q and QX type units. Platforms were enclosed. Doors were inserted into the car bodies. And all cars received multiple unit door control.
But the World's Fair cars were all steel cars also. Steel exterior and also interior. Well, they had metal hand straps in them, and they did have rattan seats originally. And they were 2-car units.
The Clark Equipment Company built the next generation car designed by the BMT. Known affectionately as Bluebirds, these compartment cars were the BMT's last effort to create lightweight cars for elevated subway service.
They had blue felt seats on the inside. They were very comfortable. They were modernistic, nice. They had signs that would change on the end over the storm door. They had what they call a Sinistron control equipment, where the motorman had only one handle for operating the train and applying the brakes. It was a modern type car. It's a nice looking car too.
Bullseye lighting fixtures and mirrors added an Art Deco touch to the interior of the cars. The heating system, ventilated panels, were housed beneath the seats, and the cooling system utilized forced air ventilation. On June 1, 1940, New York City purchased the property of the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation. On June 12, 1940, the Interborough Rapid Transit property would also be purchased. This unification resulted in perpetuating the lines known as the IRT, BMT, and IND, whose abbreviations are used to this day.
And in 1948, when the first of the new cars came in, which was the R10, it had rattan seats, but it had fluorescent lighting. The doors still operated on air, but the cars now had what they call dynamic brakes, where the cars would coast and they would use the motors as they were turning as generators to slow the train down and then use the air brakes to stop it.
1948 to 1949, also brought the R11s. They were 10 cars built by Budd for the proposed 2nd Avenue subway. They were BMT and IND cars.
An all stainless steel car. It was built in 1948. And it had heaters in the seats that were different. In other words, they used the dynamic brakes of the car as the train would slow down when the motors became generators. The electricity that was generated by these motors was funneled to resistors. And the resistors were mounted in a box, and there was a blower in the box that would blow the heat underneath the seat to warm up the car.
In 1953, the New York City subway system was placed under the control of the New York City Transit Authority. The acquisition made the New York City subway eligible for state funding for certain projects. However, ownership of the physical plant and equipment would remain with the city. The 1950s also ushered in a new car called the R16. They were 60 feet long and 10 feet wide and were built by the American Car and Foundry Company. They went into service on January 11, 1955 on the Jamaica line.
The seating on the IRT cars remained longitudinal throughout the career, even all the new cars that have come through today.
Between the late 1940s and early 1950s, new IRT cars began to serve the Queens section of the IRT. The R17, R21, and R22 replaced the old high-voltage equipment, including the 1904 Gibbs car.
Recalling the old cars, and in my opinion, which were the best to operate, I would say they were the newer R-type cars, the SME cars. They were more reliable, and they were very responsive. The cars would accelerate nicely, and when you had to brake, you could really make a smooth stop, and you would give the passengers a nice ride.
About 1960, we came in with an R22, which ran on the Grand Central as a Grand Central station as an ATO unit, automatic train operator, where at that time we had a train operator, or motorman as they called him in those days. He sat in a cab, and all he did was monitor the train. As a safety procedure, they put a train operator or motorman in the cab.
The R21 and R22 were almost identical to the R17, including performance. One of the most beloved trains by passengers was the Redbird. It was comprised of 5 distinct types of IRT cars that became famous for their longevity and presence on the IRT lines. The R26 and R28 classes were the last cars built by the American Car and Foundry Company for New York City, delivered between 1959 and 1961. Built by the St. Louis Car Company, the R29s featured a bright red exterior paint scheme with pleasant colors for the interiors. With picture windows and a powder blue and off-white paint scheme, the R33S was a small fleet of 40 single cars manufactured in the World's Fair car configuration. The R36s were attractive new cars for the 1964 World's Fair. They replaced the R12 and R14 on the Flushing line. On the BMT and IND lines, the Budd Company won the bid for the R32s. Their proposal was for all stainless steel cars, saving weight and reducing maintenance. The R32 class is still running after 40 years. The end of the 1960s brought about another change, not to the cars themselves, but to the agency that runs them. In 1968, the New York State Legislature created the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which became the New York City Transit Authority's parent organization. In 1971, under the MTA, the New York City Transit Authority purchased the R44s. They were a radical departure from the previous subway cars. These BMT and IND cars were 75 feet in length. They were high-speed, high-tech cars, resembling a railroad commuter coach. The idea was that 8 cars could provide the same service as 10.
It was too much too soon. From a technical point of view, this design changed quite a bit on the R44. It was revolutionary instead of being evolutionary. These cars were capable of high speeds. They held the world record for a subway train of more than 87 miles an hour. There were longer trains, more similar to the commuter trains being used on the Long Island Railroad and Metro-North. And they also had the different modes of operation, including automatic train operation.
After the bad times of the 1970s and a period of rebuilding in the 1980s, the decision was made to overhaul the existing fleet. An effective maintenance program, known as Scheduled Maintenance System, or SMS, allowed the fleet to return to a state of good repair.
SMS is an acronym for Scheduled Maintenance System. This is a program that overhauls the primary components of the subway car. For example, the pneumatic components, the motors, the undercarriage, which consists of the truck's wheels and motors, the car body. All of these very important components that go into making the subway car operate efficiently are overhauled periodically.
The R62 and R62A changed very little from their predecessors, the R36s.
When it was time to buy the R62 cars, the MTA formed a steering committee to come up with a design for these new cars. At the time it was decided that based on the poor experience with the R44 and 46, we should go back to a more conventional design. And actually the technical specification for the R62 was that the R62 had to be compatible with the R36. Now the R36 were built and delivered in the early 60s. So it's like we took a step backwards, almost 20 years backwards in technology to make it simple and more reliable.
During the early 1990s, Kawasaki Railcar and Bombardier Transportation built both the R110A and R110B, which were referred to as the new technology trains. These were to be the next generation of new technology subway cars.
Based on our lesson learned from the R44 and 46, where we procure new cars without testing new technology first, MTA made a very wise decision that before we buy hundreds of new cars, which were coming up in the future years, we would test the technology first on 2 prototype trains.
A few of the revolutionary improvements are alternating current motors, passenger intercoms, and automatic station announcements. Beginning in October 2000 through May 2005, New York City Transit has accepted and placed into service a total of 1,842 rail cars referred to as New Millennium trains. The R142, R142A, R142S, and R143 cars are designed to improve safety and reliability. Passengers have more amenities, such as flip-up seats, improved interior layout, along with a smoother, safer ride.
For me, the biggest improvement has to be announcement quality. For years, we were always told that announcements were inaudible or we had defective public address systems. With the onboard announcements or the automated announcements, those complaints are very few and far between.
While it would take weeks to talk about the development of the subway cars, Gene Sansone has put it all together in a book entitled New York Subways, an illustrated history of New York City's transit cars. The book outlines passenger car development for every type of New York City rapid transit car from 1903 to the present day.
We felt we needed to bring it up to date and to include description and an historical and technical narrative about the New Millennium Trains fleet, the R142, 42A, the R143, and 160. And that's what the Centennial Edition does. Basically, it brings the historical history of subway car engineering all the way up to present day.
660 rail cars will be built by Alstom Transportation and Kawasaki Railcar to replace the aging B Division fleet. Some of the newly purchased R160 cars were delivered by Kawasaki in July and August of 2005 and are undergoing various tests and inspections prior to being placed into service.
The design of the subway car is based on an evolution whereby we look at the design of previous car classes and learning lessons from what worked, what didn't work, we will specify the new car requirements. As long as we follow this process of evolution, we had a lot of success. So what we need at the MTA, we don't need revolution in design. We need step-by-step evolutionary process, which guarantees that our trains are modern, they have the latest technology, however, it's proven and it's reliable.
The New York City subway is an amazing system. It's long, has hundreds of stations, was built by 3 different companies on elevated, at-grade underground and trench tracks, and can be daunting to navigate, especially for the uninitiated. On top of that, trying to understand the various services, infrastructure, and unusual elements of the system adds an additional challenge. So in this very special transit explainer, let's break down what the New York City subway is, how it works, what makes it special, and where it's going. This is actually my second attempt at explaining the New York City subway, and the challenging thing with a system as large as the subway is that if you try to get too specific, you really miss the forest for the trees. It's just impossible to make a video that tells you every single nitty-gritty detail of a system while also still being a useful summary, which is kind of the point of an explainer. And this is especially true when your system has local and express stations and over 25 different services that operate. So today's video won't tell you about everything, but pretty much everything you'll actually want to know. I'll talk about how the broader network comes together, what makes it so special when compared to basically every other metro system out there, because in all honesty there are all the world's other metros and subways, and then there's New York. So what makes the New York City subway so epic and so different from other systems? Well, for one, the trains are generally quite long. Many lines operate 10-car trains, and even the narrower trains on the system are often very long as 11 cars. By comparison, many other systems have 8 or 6 or even 5-car long trains. Perhaps even more uniquely, New York City has extensive express services across the subway. These exist both in suburban areas as well as right in the city center, and they are the norm, not the exception, since many of the system's lines have an additional track or tracks entirely dedicated to express trains. This means that even in the densest parts of the city, you can move around very rapidly. At the same time, New York doesn't just have a lot of different subway lines with lots of tracks, but also an almost unbelievable number of connections between them. This allows train services to run across the city from one line to another, and that heavy interlining means that even across the giant system, many trips can be made with a single change of train. All of this infrastructure allows New York to selectively shut down different tracks and lines on a weekly and nightly basis, so that a basic level of service is always running, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And because New York has done this for so long, it actually can't stop, as it doesn't have enough yard space to store all the trains that are in use in the system. Some always need to be out there running. Now, understanding the system does require some basic geography, but we've got a lot to cover, so we need to make it fast. This is New York, and this is New Jersey. Different state, part of the region, you get it. These are the major airports: Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK, the latter of which is the only one that's really connected to proper rapid transit at the moment. New York City is comprised of 5 different boroughs: Staten Island, which has a railway related to the subway, but not the subway and not directly connected to other passenger rail services, so sorry, not today. As well as Queens, the Bronx, Brooklyn, and of course Manhattan, an island hemmed in by the Hudson River to the west and the East River to the east. This is Central Park, this is the Financial District, this is Midtown, where Times Square and most of the major tourist attractions are, and these are Penn Station and Grand Central Terminal, which you can learn more about in a previous video. Unlike many much younger subway systems that have been built by public agencies, the New York City transit system was built by private companies. Well, mostly. It's complicated. The subway was originally composed of the private IRT and BMT systems. The IRT, or Interborough Rapid Transit, owned tons of different elevated lines throughout the city, including in Manhattan, most of which were subsequently removed. And its lines are now numbered routes that operate smaller, 2.7 meter wide and 15.5 meter long cars that run through Manhattan and into the outer boroughs, particularly the Bronx. The BMT, or Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Company, started out as the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, the BRT, and as you'd expect, mostly served Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan in particular, with a number of different crossings of the East River. The trains used on the BMT parts of the system are larger than the IRT trains at about 3 meters wide and either 18.5 or 23 meters long, similar in size to the London S-Dock cars and the Toronto subway cars respectively. And it actually has two further sizes of trains because of the restrictive geometry of some of its lines, and so the trains with longer cars can and could only operate in parts of the system. That being said, the subway system as a whole is slowly standardizing around the shorter cars for universal compatibility. Now, with these two private companies being so critical to transportation in New York City, the city decided to create its own independent system, and thus the IND, or Independent, was born. The IND was set up to compete with the IRT and BMT, or more specifically, run them into the ground. However, in other cases, this was just to replace their outdated elevated lines, which had the NIMBYs up in arms all the way back in the early 1900s. Beyond this, the IND had some pretty notable features, like being almost entirely underground, even through pretty low-density areas because, well, it was meant to replace the elevated lines, and having large mezzanines at some stations that let you walk all the way through them without going onto the platforms. Basically, it was overbuilt. Ironically, despite it not necessarily being the plan, the systems all ended up getting rolled into one, and because of this, you have situations like 23rd Street, where you have two IND lines straddling an IRT line with about 200 meters between each, and the BMT line 350 meters east of that, all of which are of course known as 23rd Street. In the decade since the systems merged in 1940, they've slowly been integrated together with more and more connecting lines between them. The BMT and IND in particular with their larger trains that were mostly the same size, while these smaller IRT trains have been kept separate for obvious reasons. Between this and the replacement of sections of the network that used to be elevated with subways, you end up with this hodgepodge of different shorter lines tied together by various connecting and transition tracks, which means it's hard to see without a lot of research how the old systems were and how things came together. That will probably have to be its own video coming next year. Now, to get into detail on the network, we should start, as the New York City subway wayfinding system does, with the lines going through Manhattan, the commercial center and densest part of New York City. The broad north-south lines in Manhattan are not the only lines on the subway, but they are likely the most impressive, and they really are the system's backbone. As it stands today, the north-south trunks are 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue, Broadway, 6th Avenue, and Lexington Avenue. All of these trunks have 4 tracks. Impressive, I know, and they carry the following routes known as trains in New York, through central Manhattan. 8th Avenue has the A, C, and E trains, which run out into northern Manhattan as well as eastern Queens and Brooklyn. 7th Avenue has the 1, 2, and 3 trains, which travel out to Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. The Broadway line carries the N, Q, R, and W trains, which travel to the Upper East Side of Manhattan on the 2nd Avenue subway, as well as North and Central Queens and Southern Brooklyn. You also might notice that 7th Avenue and Broadway swap roles and bounce off of each other, so that south of Times Square, the 1, 2, 3 serve 7th Avenue, and the N, Q, R, and W serve Broadway, while the reverse is true to the north. 6th Avenue has the B, D, F, and M trains, which travel the most extensively to serve eastern and central Queens, the Bronx, and central and southern Brooklyn. And finally, the most used subway line in North America, the Lexington Avenue line, which handles the 4, 5, and 6 trains that travel north to serve a large swath of the central and eastern Bronx, as well as central Brooklyn. Now, to be clear, local and express services mix across the system, and so each numbered or lettered train service represents not only some combination of lines, but also a combination of local and express services. And even within a single letter or number, you can have a mix. For example, the E train is express in Queens and local in Manhattan, while the 4 train is express in Manhattan and Brooklyn and local in the Bronx. At the same time, service changes a lot depending on ongoing works, as well as at night or during delays, so sometimes a train that usually uses one route will use another, and sometimes trains that usually run local will run express, and vice versa. And we haven't even got to all the different lines yet. There are also the J and Z, which don't go to Midtown and instead run from the financial district through the Lower East Side, across the Williamsburg Bridge, alongside the M train, and then through northern Brooklyn into Queens. The J and Z operate as a skip-stop express service for part of their length in the east during peak periods, and also have triple-track express service further west, which actually exists on a lot of the suburban parts of the network, particularly the older elevateds, and generally corresponds with a peak-only express service. The 7 and the L trains are super interesting. They each run crosstown, that means east-west, in Manhattan on 42nd Street and 14th Street, and then out into the outer boroughs, Queens and Brooklyn, respectively. These lines have seen major ridership growth in recent decades and don't interline with other services, and because of these former 2 points, they've been New York's entryway into modern CBTC signaling, which allows trains to operate at a high frequency and just seconds apart. It also contributes to the high reliability of these routes. The 7 also plays host to one of the newest sections on the entire subway network, its western extension from Times Square 42nd Street to 34th Street Hudson Yards, which gives me Canary Wharf vibes. I also did want to mention that something about the perceived depth and tight layout of the 7 train stop at Grand Central just has it seared into my mind. The G train, or the Brooklyn-Queens Crosstown, is really interesting as well. It's moderately low demand and runs between Brooklyn and Queens, being the only non-shuttle service to not serve Manhattan. Since it was built by the IND, it's also all underground in its main section between Long Island City and downtown Brooklyn. The last services, and I've already sort of referred to them, are the shuttles, of which there are 3. The Rockaway Park Shuttle that operates on the Rockaways branch of the A train route, the Franklin Avenue Shuttle that operates between Prospect Park on the BMT Brighton line and Franklin Avenue on the IND Fulton Street line, and the most interesting shuttle of all, the 42nd Street Shuttle, that operates using tracks and tunnels that originally connected the Lexington Avenue and 7th Avenue IRT lines with 4 tracks. Beyond just the subway, there are 2 other subway-style services worth mentioning that are connected directly to the subway, operate 24 hours a day, and have historically also used the same fare medium as well. For one, you have the PATH, which was originally known as the Hudson and Manhattan Railway, or simply the Hudson Tubes, a rapid transit system built in a similar spirit to the early London Underground lines, connecting passengers from railway terminals in New Jersey to their final destinations in Manhattan under the Hudson River. These days, the network runs 4 services from each of the 2 major hubs in New Jersey, Hoboken and Journal Square, to both Midtown, meaning the PATH actually has its own 2-track tunnel under 6th Avenue from about 10th to 34th Street, in addition to the 6th Avenue subway line, and downtown Manhattan at the World Trade Center, via 2 separate sets of under-river tunnels and 2 fully grade-separated underground Ys. Service also runs beyond Journal Square on a surface right-of-way outside of the Northeast Corridor, straddling it for a portion of its route. And the PATH also has some big flyovers going into Newark, which it does over a lift bridge, which is all super interesting and unique. Because of its proximity to the Northeast Corridor, the PATH, which stands for Port Authority Trans-Hudson, is regulated as a mainline railway. I must say, I've always quite liked the PATH, and I've always felt like it's in better shape than much of the subway. And it's stationed at the reconstructed World Trade Center, which is comprised of 5 tight loops of track into 4 different platforms, is easily the ritziest subway station in New York City. There's also the AirTrain JFK, which is an automated rail system serving JFK Airport and connecting it with 2 different subway stations along with the Long Island Railroad. I find the AirTrain rather interesting because it uses the same technology as the Vancouver SkyTrain, but with wide trains, double crossovers, and platform screen doors, the only place where a subway-style service in New York uses them right now. That said, despite being automated, the system annoys people quite a bit because of the high additional fare required to use it. I've always found Federal Circle Station on it particularly interesting as the branch point of the 2 different subway connecting services, because in the spirit of the recent video I did on Barcelona Line 9, it actually splits the platforms across 2 levels as part of the design of its flyovers. One thing I've been asked by a lot of people returning from trips to New York is where all of the elevated trains are. The reality is that if you're visiting New York, and as many tourists do, spending most of your time in Manhattan and maybe downtown Brooklyn, you might never encounter an L, since the Queens Boulevard subway line that you may well take in from JFK or LaGuardia is underground. My last trip to New York in 2017 actually had me taking a shuttle from Howard Beach Station to Euclid Avenue, and so that was a similar story. But in my recent trip to New York, and in recent years, I feel like a big part of the story of the city has been the growth outside of Manhattan. Manhattan has grown, but the change in New York has been much more pronounced in places like Brooklyn and Long Island City. I think the shifting focus in the city may bring the L's more attention because there are a lot of them, but mostly not in the classic tourist hotspots. For example, the 7 is mostly elevated outside of Manhattan, and the Astoria line is entirely so, as is the easternmost part of the A and the 3. Most of the JZ up to and across the Williamsburg Bridge are also elevated, as is the Myrtle Avenue section of the M, and at Broadway Junction where the J, Z, and L create an insane spaghetti bowl of tracks, with both of the lines elevated while the A and C pass underground. There's also the southern part of the L, F, and D, and the viaduct at Smith 9th Streets on the F and G, which is also the highest point on the system. Outside of Queens and Brooklyn, the northernmost parts of the 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 in the Bronx are also all elevated, as well as a wee bit of the 1 in Manhattan. Of course, there are also some lines that are at grade, like the A to Far Rockaway, which travels on a causeway formerly used by LIRR services, as well as on embankments and in trenches like the Brighton and Sea Beach lines. But more than you might think, even out to the burbs, the subway is in tunnel, so while Manhattan does have very little L, the outer boroughs do have quite a bit of subway, including Grand Concourse in the Bronx, Central Brooklyn, and the G, L, and Queens Boulevard lines. Now, while the subway is notable for its scale and the impact it's had on New York City, I still think it goes underappreciated just how good the system is, even when compared to contemporary examples. And that's often because of the incredible foresight on the part of those planning and engineering subway lines 70 or 120 years ago. New York really set the standard for building for the future. Big stations, express tracks, and far more, like bell mouths and spur tracks designed to allow future lines and extensions, as well as space left unused only to be dusted off decades later and put into action. New York also has abundant cross-platform transfers, in part because of all of the quad-track and interlining combined with dual-island platform stations, but there's also notable stacked examples, like Lexington 63rd, which connects onto the 2nd Avenue subway, and the epic Queensboro Plaza, which is easily one of my favorite stations in the world and used to be twice as big. Amazingly, Queensboro Plaza shows something else that impresses: the amount of out-of-use or straight-up abandoned infrastructure in the system. From the spurs for no longer there tracks that you see heading west on the 7 train, to connector tunnels between the JZ and the Montague Street Tunnel, or the unused elevated structures along Myrtle Avenue or at Broadway Junction. More than almost any other system in the world, there are also a crazy number of water crossings, including more than 10 different underwater tunnels as well as a handful of bridges. There's also almost an unbelievable amount of infrastructure lying under Midtown Manhattan, below some of the densest development in the world, and honestly across the whole system. This includes underground flyovers, which are huge and most people don't even realize are below their feet, not to mention tunnels going over or under other tunnels. For example, in Midtown, the 6th Avenue line splits into 3 routes heading north, east, and west around 53rd Street, with a bunch of different underground flyovers and unders, including tracks which interact with those coming off the 8th Avenue line in a fully grade-separated underground Y. Something similar happens with the Broadway line just south of Central Park, where it splits into 2 different eastbound lines, one of which becomes vertically stacked to provide cross-platform transfers with the northern track from the 6th Avenue line at the aforementioned Lexington Avenue 63rd. There are also tons of crazy junctions in lower Manhattan, such as where the quad-track 6th and 8th Avenue lines interleave in a stacked arrangement. On the southern end of the quad-track portion of the 6th Avenue line, there is also a crazy junction with 4 more underground flyovers, distributing trains onto Christie Street for the Manhattan Bridge North tracks, Essex Street and the Rutgers Street tunnels for the F train, and Delancey Street for connection to the Brooklyn M service along with the J and Z trains. The center tracks of the Broadway and 7th Avenue lines also have underground dive-unders at Canal and Chambers Street respectively. Saving the best for last, downtown Brooklyn has an absurd number of tunnels and underground connections crisscrossing it. From an underground Y between 3 quad-track lines west of Hoyt-Schermerhorn, including a connection to Court Street, which is now the Transit Museum. There's also a mess of tracks just south of DeKalb Avenue that bring together the B, Q, D, N, and R trains, not to mention the merge between the 2, 3, and 4, 5 trains at Court Street Borough Hall, and the G under and then into the middle of the Fulton Street line. And of course, all of these very